Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Marie Newton, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so please hold your questions until that time, and you can then type them into the question box. If you have questions after the webinar has ended, please feel free to email me, and I will forward them to the appropriate person that can answer them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on CABE's website under Professional Development. And now I'd like to introduce Lisa Steimer, Senior Staff Associate for Professional Development and Communications.
Great, thank you, Will Marie, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Board's Role in Communications webinar. I'm really thrilled today to introduce our presenter, Chris Horan, who has over 25 years of experience in communications, political and policy advocacy, and education. As the founder and managing partner of Horan Communications, Chris provides coaching and consulting services in strategic communications to school districts, public agencies, nonprofits, and emerging businesses. Chris really does get the business that we're all in. He previously served as the first Chief Communications Officer for the Boston Public Schools, designing and executing the launch of an award-winning communications strategy for the largest public school district in New England. Chris has served as a consultant and coach to superintendents and other district leaders across the country in strategic communications to advance academic and operational priorities. So Chris, we are really thrilled to have you with us today and look forward to all that you're going to share with us.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Patrice, for having me, and Will Marie for all of your help. It's great to be with you all today. I'm going to share my screen. Just a couple of things to get us underway. Thanks for that introduction, Lisa. As Lisa mentioned, I spent the first part of my career working for the Boston Public Schools, and a lot of what I'm going to share with you today was those ideas were sort of formulated during my years in Boston. I worked for the mayor and for the school committee, as we call them here in Massachusetts, and also for a couple of different superintendents. So in all three of those roles, I really got an interesting lens on communications, both internal within the district and also external communications, and thinking about how the district can do a better job of communicating with our families and staff in particular. One bit of housekeeping, I will send Lisa a PDF of these slides and invite her to share them with you, so you don't have to worry about trying to take copious notes. I'll give you this deck as a PDF. And you can see on the screen here that I am on Twitter. For now, anyway, we'll see if any of you are on Twitter as well. You'd like to follow me, my handle's there. Okay, so as Will Marie mentioned, I do welcome your questions. I'm gonna ask you to save them to the end, but if you wanna just jot them down in case you don't forget them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. But I also wanna start off today by inviting you all to, if I can figure out how to advance my slides. Nope. Will Marie, any tip for me to? Oh, there
Okay.
Got it. So I'm going to put you to work. A little bit different in a webinar, but I tend to be pretty interactive in my sessions. So I'm going to ask you now to use the chat function, a little different than the questions tab, but if you don't mind just clicking on the chat function, I'm going to start you off with a softball and ask you all, we're going to talk today about sort of the board's role in communications. So I want to just broaden that first and ask you to share with me what the role of the board is in more general terms. What are the key roles and responsibilities of school board members? So please put them right in the chat. Love to see your answers. I'm sure you all know this like the back of your hand. I'm not seeing anything. Will Marie, are you? Or is everyone just being quiet, or am I missing something?
I think we've got a quiet bunch today.
Doesn't have to be long answers, folks. Just like a word or two about. Oh, somebody's got a question. How do we access the chat rather than the questions? They don't see a chat box.
Okay. So I do see some answers in the question box, Chris, if you want to take a look there.
Okay, I do not see those.
The questions?
Oh, the answers are in the question box.
Yes.
Okay, someone said supervise the superintendent. That's great. What else? You can put your, I guess you can put your answers right in the questions. Establish goals and objectives. Thank you, Monica. Set the budget. Thanks, Becky. There's 3 good ones. Budget, yeah. Policy, budget, oversight. Great, Deborah. Thank you. Policy, budget, oversight, hiring and supervising the superintendent, establish policies and support the superintendent, advocate for kids. Great, all good answers. Thank you. So I want to think then about how we apply those in terms of communications. I do a lot of training with different groups. Sometimes it's board members like yourselves, sometimes it's superintendents, other times it's leadership teams, and sometimes it's a mix of those folks. So I think one of the most important sort of observations I can share, having worked in all 3 of those sort of lanes, is helping people think about organizing your roles and responsibilities. And like a lot of the trainings that CABE does and other associations like it, trying to help board members in particular think about how can you be helpful while still remaining within that sort of realm of things that you all just answered in terms of the things that you are responsible for without overstepping. And I think communications can be one of those areas where that becomes a little bit tricky, where the lines may seem blurred between when should we be communicating, how should we be communicating, what's an appropriate role for us in the district's communications work, and what should we be leaving to the superintendent. So that's primarily what we're going to explore today. So I'm going to walk you through some of what I consider sort of the most critical roles that the Board of Education members can play in effective communication. The first, as you folks mentioned, is about policy. And to me, communications is no different than in this area. It's really important that the district has a set of policies related to communications. You know, these may be very tactical things like having a policy for media relations or social media use, other things like that. When I was in the Boston Public Schools and I moved over to the position of Chief Communications Officer, one of the first tasks that I was given for the superintendent and the board chair was to draft a communications plan for the district, which is something we really hadn't had before. And we wanted to make sure that that plan was not just about me and my team and the work that we were doing, but as our board chair wisely encouraged me to make sure that everyone saw themselves in that plan and people understood what their role and responsibility was in making the Boston Public Schools more effective in terms of communication. And that started with the board. So what we did was proposed, and the board eventually adopted, a communications policy. A very high level, this is only probably a page, and I've given you the link in the bottom right corner here to the policy on the BPS website. But really, we realized that with all the policies that our school board had, there was no policy that just sort of defined what good communication looks like in a very broad sense. Not getting into the nitty-gritty or the minutia, but again, just sort of these high-level sort of commitments that we were sharing with the community about what we believed good communications looked like. And then our communications plan was designed to sort of carry out that policy. It was the implementation strategy for adhering to what we considered these sort of norms in communication. So it did a couple of things. One, it helped the school committee sort of feel like they had a role, an important role at the outset of this work. But it also helped them sort of see how to stay in their lane. But it sent a strong signal to the community about what BPS was really committing to or recommitting to in terms of effective communication. Okay. So that's the first. The second, of course, given that several of you answered with your important role about the budget and sort of fiscal oversight, is making sure that you're allocating sufficient resources for the district's communications work. This is no different than anything else. If you want effective facilities, you've got to make sure that you allocate the funds to keep those facilities maintained. Same for communications. And a lot of times we may see an alignment or a disconnect between what a school board says they want in terms of communications and the resources that they may or may not allocate to the superintendent and his or her team to operationalize those expectations. So I think one of the most important questions for boards and the superintendents is, what do we need to build into our budget in terms of resources for communications? Obviously, the question is often about staff and whether or not we need to allocate resources to be able to hire one or more people to provide oversight and direction and leadership in communications. So I want to take a minute just to sort of reflect on that question for a second. I spoke to Lisa earlier this week just to try to get a sense about whether Connecticut is like Massachusetts in this regard, and it sounds like it pretty much is, that most of the larger districts would have at least one, if not more than one, person dedicated to a communications function, someone whose job is sort of exclusively about communications. Some mid-sized districts may do the same, but most small districts, it sounds like, do not have sort of the resources and the capacity to do that. And that's very much like it is here in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island, where I also do a lot of work. So I think what we're finding is that two things. One, districts are realizing more and more that they need help to do this well. And in places where there is no dedicated staff, so much of this work often falls to the superintendent, who obviously should be spending his or her time being the instructional leader for the district and doing all the important work of the CEO, rather than writing press releases or having to worry about social media or all those other sort of communications tasks. So districts, I think particularly in the wake of COVID, realized just the great demands that are out there with communications. We're in a 24/7 media cycle. Social media obviously is taking on a greater role all the time. There are just so many issues that are coming at you that you need someone to manage that. And you want to be able to do a better job of sort of getting your message out and telling your story. So what I'm finding is, especially again, sort of post-COVID, districts are saying, this is crazy. We can't keep doing this on a shoestring. Some are deciding to hire communications staff, maybe just one person, maybe part-time, maybe full-time, to really lead that work. Others are hiring someone like me, a communications consultant, either on a short-term basis or an ongoing basis, to be able to provide support during crisis situations, to be able to advise about messaging and strategy and all the stuff we're going to talk about today. Others are finding folks within their community. I know a couple of superintendents who have, someone who works from home. Maybe it's a parent who has some background in communications or writing or press or PR, and can devote a certain number of hours per week to this work without having to be, employee who gets salary and benefits. Which is obviously a much bigger commitment on the part of the district. So there's lots of different ways to sort of cobble this together. I also want to just share with you a relatively new resource that our own Lisa Steimer is very involved in, and that is the New England School Public Relations Association. So there's a national organization called NSPRA, the National School Public Relations Association, which is folks around the country like me, like folks in positions like Lisa's, or more likely district communications staff. And it's sort of their professional development organization to learn about their craft, to compare notes with their peers. And there have been regional chapters for many, many years, but New England was not represented. And thanks to Lisa and a couple of other folks from around New England, we now have, within the last 2 years, what's being called NSPRA, the New England School PR Association. So if your districts have folks in this position, really encourage them to learn more about it and also to be a resource. Lisa, can I invite you to just say a word or two about NSPRA?
Sure, absolutely, Chris, and thank you very much for sharing this resource with folks. So this resource is for the professionals in your district who are doing your communications work, whether it be professional public relations folks, sometimes the superintendent, as Chris mentioned earlier, sometimes the superintendent's administrative professional is doing this work. We have members from all three categories, as well as consultants such as Chris, folks that are working in a setting such as mine, in a state association or a regional association of sorts. We provide online resources for our members. We also provide periodic check-ins, much like the monthly board check-ins, board chair check-ins that CABE does for board chairs, to talk about issues of concern. For instance, tomorrow there is a NSPRA check-in, and we're talking about swatting. That has been a huge issue around New England, around the country, frankly. And as recently as yesterday, Vermont was getting a number of swatting calls. So we talk about timely issues. We also have an annual conference, which is coming up in May, which is a great time to share and exchange ideas and hear from national leaders. So I would say if you have folks in your district who you think would benefit from this membership, reach out to me, share my email address, tell them to call me at CABE, and I'd be happy to share additional information with them because it really is a valuable resource.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And I couldn't agree more. It really has been so valuable just seeing the interactions both online and in person among these professionals to be able to trade ideas and just commiserate at times too. So all this is to say that there's no one size fits all for what your communications infrastructure should look like. But I do think it's important for the school board and the superintendent to be on the same page about what your investment in that infrastructure is going to be. And no matter how you cobble it together, to be very intentional about the commitments that you're going to make. Certainly many districts right now are going through budget planning for FY24. It's a great time to have that conversation with your superintendent. The fact that you're on this webinar means you are thinking about this stuff. So it's a really good opportunity to sort of go back and have a conversation with the superintendent about whether or not you have staff. If not, how else are you supporting the superintendent and his or her team in this work? Okay, which brings us to the third important responsibility that school boards have in terms of effective communication. Several of you mentioned in my initial prompt the important role you have in hiring and evaluating the superintendent and giving him or her opportunities to grow as a professional too. And communication should certainly be part of that. Most rubrics that I've seen for superintendent evaluation have some combination of measures of the superintendent's effectiveness in communication, sometimes framed as community relations, sometimes as specific as media relations, all kinds of different ways to examine it. But this is a really important role for you. So if you are dissatisfied perhaps with the way the superintendent is leading communications, rather than going and micromanaging that work, the important thing for you to do is to reflect that in the evaluation. And also to give your superintendent, if there is area for growth, the professional development that they need in order to get better in this work. That's a lot of what I do with some of my clients who are sometimes new superintendents, sometimes more veteran, but who really want to shore up their skills and knowledge in communications, whether it's helping them with their messaging, with dealing with the press, or any other sort of important component of this work. Just like your teachers and your principals, they may need some coaching or mentoring or professional development in this area. So I'm sure a lot of you are doing this already, but I just wanted to share one evaluation that I found online that's sort of case in point. This one from New Haven, a number of different standards that the superintendent is evaluated on, of course. And this one is culture and climate. And it's just a really clear example of the ways that communication is clearly an important skill set for the superintendent, and also a clear indication of how you may be able to measure the performance in this area, whether it's about how the district is perceived internally and externally, the superintendent's own communication skills, written, verbal, and so on, but also this two-way piece that we're going to talk about today, where communication isn't just pushing out and telling people our message and the stories that we want to tell, but how is the superintendent and the board for that matter in promoting two-way engagement and making sure our stakeholders feel involved and engaged and that they have a voice in the process, especially for decision making. So we're going to talk more about that in a second. So our fourth point is just that. It's making sure that the board is providing opportunities for families and the community to have input and engagement on, especially on matters related to the board, policy, budget, and the other things that you folks brought up earlier. This is a critical role for the school board. It can be a very broad role, I realize, and it takes many different forms. So we want to just spend a few minutes today talking about what that may look like and how you can sort of be involved in getting your community to feel like they have opportunities for input and engagement while also staying in those lanes that we talked about. So I think one of the things that goes without saying is just board meetings and how challenging they have become really all over the country, some places more than others, and in some cases being sort of a three-ring circus for some of the political fighting that we see going on. Some of you who may have been on the webinar we did with CABE a while back may recognize some of these images ripped from the headlines about angry parents and storming school board meetings over LGBTQ issues. Right in your own backyard in Glastonbury, a brawl over mascots at a school board meeting. The New York Times covering this, saying that more and more we're seeing school board meetings getting weird and scary. And sadly, in some cases, board members feeling personally threatened because people are so vitriolic about things like masks and vaccination and learning models during the pandemic to these other very polarized political issues like LGBTQ stuff and Black Lives Matter and other sort of race issues, diversity, equity, inclusion work that are really sort of reaching a fever pitch. And we're finding that boards more and more are trying to sort of corral some of that chaos, and particularly at board meetings, trying to find ways to keep the peace while still giving people a chance to be heard. And in some cases, the courts are pushing back on that. Right here in my state, the Natick School Committee, which is what we call our school boards, got a ruling from state court saying that the rules they'd put in place for their public comment period were too narrow and didn't allow for people to say some of what they had a right to say in the eyes of the court, and impinged on their the right to free speech. So it's become an interesting landmark case here that boards are certainly looking at, and I'm sure that plays out in different ways in Connecticut and elsewhere too. So what I'm also seeing, as you probably are too, is boards sometimes saying, you know what, it's such a mess out there, and these things deteriorate so quickly that maybe we don't want to engage, at least not in that format. Maybe we're better off just finding other ways for people to speak their mind without having this microphone and giving people a platform to tear us apart and at times tear one another apart. So I wanted to just share, first of all, some tips, some of which you've probably heard at other sort of CABE sessions about what you can do to sort of keep Board of Education meetings somewhat civil to the extent that you can. Some of the things that I've shared with folks over the years is one, to be really clear about how your board allows for public comment in the session. Some states are more prescriptive than others about what is and isn't required of boards in terms of public comment. But regardless of what the state mandates, your open meeting law or whatever it may be, and what your district has adopted, being really clear, in fact, at every meeting about what those expectations are and what the protocols are. So folks who may have never, some folks I'm sure come to every meeting, you know those frequent flyers, but there are others who may be at the meeting for the first time. And it's important for the chair or someone at that meeting to lay out what those rules are. I'll make this up as I go. We allow up to 30 minutes for public comment. We allow each speaker up to 3 minutes to say their remarks, and we'll give you 30-second warning when you're about to wrap up. We reserve the right to extend that public comment time. We ask that you not speak about any individual students or staff members by name to protect privacy. Those kinds of guidelines that people need to hear in order to know how public comment is allowed to go. Now, I'll tell you this. Some districts I've seen have in their agenda public comment, general public comment, where folks can talk about just about anything. Others may have another section called public comment on action items, where people have additional time or discrete time to talk about matters that are going to be voted on that night at that meeting. I've also seen districts have a segment called response to public comment. Personally, from a professional standpoint, I'm not a big fan of this approach. My sort of philosophy about public comment is it's really just that. It is the public's chance to have their say. And the rest of the meeting is your chance to do your business, make your presentations, engage in dialogue and discussion and deliberation, but to leave public comment for what it is. I think the minute that you try to respond to public comment, it's a very slippery slope. One, how do you respond to everyone? You can't. So then you end up having to pick and choose which comments you want to address, which ones you don't. And people can feel either like you're playing favorites or leaving people out. It's also just often the optics of it are that the Board of Education gets the last word. Here's the public and they get up and they say their piece, and then the board gets to either rebut or challenge or clarify, but it's they who get the last word. And to me, that sort of undermines, I think, the spirit of public comment. So folks obviously have to make their own choices, but my advice is that I've never seen that work tremendously well. along those lines, I think, this goes without saying, but it really is an important point to consider. When folks are engaged in public comment, even if what they're saying strikes you as outrageous or blatantly false, just have to sort of let it ride. I've seen some board members who are really good at this and can sit up at the dais, not just stone-faced, but actually making it clear from their body language and their facial expressions that they're listening to what everyone has to say. There's no eye rolling, no side glancing to your colleagues, no shaking of the head, nothing to indicate that you are either in favor of or in opposition to what you're hearing, but truly to take it all in, to take notes if you have to, but really to be respectful, even of those who may have views that are very different than yours. Now, of course, the chair has a lot of purview in terms of trying to keep the peace and also reining people in. So if anyone is really out of line or is inappropriate with their language or threatening or violating those rules of privacy and confidentiality, then obviously the chair may step in with the gavel and say, you're out of line and you need to wrap up. But for the most part, otherwise, I think it's the board's job and the superintendent's job to take it all in and really listen and be thoughtful about what you're hearing, even if it's something that you may not want to hear. Okay. So another question I hear in terms of how we engage folks, especially parents who have questions or concerns or ideas or problems that they're trying to solve. More and more I'm hearing boards say, I want to be helpful. And I know that part of my job is to be an ear for my constituents. And part of the reason they may have elected me is because they want to be able to come to me with their problems. But I also know as a board member that I have to stay in my lane and that a lot of what people come to me with is not policy related. It's not budget related. It's not about the superintendent's evaluation. So it's something far more operational, a question that has to do with teaching and learning at the child's school, or an IEP, or something very operational that all I can do is send them to the superintendent. So I want to be able to do that in a way that is helpful and doesn't seem like I'm just passing the buck. It's a really good question, and I think it's a really artful thing for school board members to learn as to how to sort of handle constituent relations in a way that people feel like you are shepherding their concern, pointing them in the right direction, putting them in touch with people who can help without just saying, yeah, that's not a board thing, go talk to downtown. So I want to turn to Patrice for a second, because in planning this session, Lisa shared with me a resource that I think can be really helpful to you that CABE has put together. And I want to invite Patrice to talk to you a little bit about it.
Thanks so much, Chris, and this is very informative. So we put together this chart that helps board members have some guidance when they're approached in the grocery store or at some soccer game in town, and they're approached by a member of the community. They want to be helpful. They were elected to the board because they want to help connect the community to the Board of Education. But often what they will be asked about is not something that they will be able to respond to or resolve. But what board members have is an important role in helping the community, particularly parents, understand how their concerns can be addressed. So when you look at this chart, you see if they have a concern about the classroom, you begin by saying, well, have you talked to the teacher? And then you go through the process, depending upon what the person shares with you, as to where they have already engaged in the process, if they've engaged at all. So a concern about the school, you begin with recommending they talk to the building administrator. A concern about the district, you probably know who in central office would be responsible for transportation, for example. So when the community member, the parent says, I'm really concerned about the safety of the bus stop, you're not going to take it upon yourself to go out as a school board member and look at the bus stop and make a judgment about its safety, but you're going to refer them to the right channel. A concern about the board, a community member may say, well, where are we on the strategic plan? What are the board's goals going forward? Those are something that you as a school board member would be in a good position to respond to. And finally, if you're not sure who to direct them to, encourage them to call the central office.
In that case, it might be a good idea to give the superintendent a heads up that someone might be calling, and the reason they're calling is you've referred them to that channel of communication.
Great, thanks, Patrice. Obviously, this image is in the slide, and you'll get the slide deck. But Lisa, do you want to indicate how people can get the document itself?
Yeah, sure. So we can share this with folks as well. So watch your email following this, and it will be included as a standalone PDF.
Great, thank you. So just sort of wrapping up this point about input and engagement. Obviously, this is a much larger topic, and I did have the good fortune of working on a webinar about a year ago about the art of listening. And it was all about this very question of how can boards do a better job of sort of getting input and engaging the community, especially during these very polarizing times. And without sort of rehashing that entire workshop, I think one of the important takeaways I want to share is that the board meeting shouldn't be the only way that folks have an opportunity to address and engage with board members. And I've seen districts do a really nice job of creating other opportunities outside the constraints of a board meeting to have conversations with your stakeholders. So in Boston, one of our board members really took the lead and set up a series of what she called community forums that were far less sort of rigid than a board meeting may be, and she purposely sort of organized them around different topics. So one month, the topic may have been English learners. Another topic may have been STEM education. Sort of very broad topics where we wanted to get people's ideas about these sort of big picture issues, but not necessarily in advocacy for or against a particular policy decision, but rather just to come and have a conversation about those things. And she set it up so it wasn't the school board up front and the public out in their seats and it's an us-them optics, but rather sort of round tables of, let's say, 8 or 10. And at every table was a mix of a board member, a principal, a teacher, a parent, a student, and everyone sort of was equal in those conversations, if you will. It wasn't parents talking to the board and the board talking back to parents. It was truly conversations that were facilitated. There were guiding questions, there were note takers, and it really just created a very different dynamic than, again, the limitations of a board meeting. And again, there are lots of different ways to go about this, but I was encouraging to me just to see a board really tackle a very different approach. There are also, listening sessions, coffee hours. I've seen some districts where the superintendent goes out to coffee hours with a different board member each month. Perhaps to different neighborhoods or different schools. And again, not necessarily for us to do the talking and to share what we're up to, but really to hear from parents and teachers and students and others about what's on their mind. Maybe in a problem-solving way in some cases, but if nothing else, really just to listen at times. It's really important to remember that people just sometimes want to be heard. On the problem-solving piece, it is worth noting, just following up on the document that Patrice shared, that it's really important for your district to have a system in place to sort of close the loop on those things. That we have found that, if a board member does bring to the superintendent or the director of transportation or the special ed director or whomever, however you sort of agree to sort of handle that, that there's some way for the district to report back to the board member, not in any great detail about the case, but just to know that someone has followed up. My staff person called Mrs. Jones. We're working with her on this issue. Thanks for bringing her to our attention. You may decide to be more detailed than that, but just some way so that the board member doesn't sort of wonder whatever happened to that. And then if she runs into that parent at the soccer field or the supermarket, she doesn't sort of left out in the cold. It's really important to have that sort of system of checks and balances, I think. Okay. And then the fifth point that is such an important role for the Board of Education, of course, is, as some of you said, about sort of setting the goals and the objectives. And I call this sort of the big picture, is what's the district's mission, the vision, the goals, and the strategic priorities that you and your superintendent have crafted, presumably in concert with the community as a whole. That, to me, that package of important messages is the right content for you to go out and serve as ambassadors for. One, to sort of share all that with the community and always reminding the community, parents and staff and students and others alike, about what it is you're working on. What are we trying to accomplish here? What do we believe is our strategy to accomplish all of that? And what is the community's role in that? Also to keep them updated. Most strategic plans that I've seen have not only goals and objectives, but some sort of measurable outcomes. And at times, a dashboard or other sort of ways of showing a metric about how your progress in each of those areas. Sorry, I'm just catching up on the questions here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that important ambassador role for school boards. As I said, this is your opportunity to define and communicate the big picture. That is work that takes place between the board and the superintendent, the entire administration, with lots of input, presumably from parents, teachers, other staff, students, the community as a whole, to answer these really key questions about what are our main priorities and how will we achieve them? What are our challenges and how do we overcome them? I think sometimes we think about our communication as just, let's go tell all the good stuff that's happening. But good communication also requires transparency about what's not working quite as well. And for the board and the superintendent to be really forthcoming about those areas where you know you can do better. And to indicate not only that you recognize that need, but to articulate what your strategies are going to be to make that improvement. This is a really great place for the board to play a role in your community, to build awareness about and support for that set of messages about what it is you're going to work on and how you're going to work on it. Okay. So I would be remiss in talking about the board's role in communications without answering something that's always on or often on folks' mind, and that is sort of the role of social media in all of this. And I realize it can be a very tricky situation, to say the least, in terms of the role that social media plays. And board members often have questions about, when I see something going on social media, especially if it's an issue that sort of starts to spiral and people are losing their minds on Facebook or Twitter or wherever they're engaging, what is an appropriate role for me as an individual board member, or for us as a board as a whole, to engage or not engage? Now, I will tell you that I am an advocate for districts having a presence on social media. I think we would be very remiss if we let those conversations happen on social media and we as a district had no presence, particularly on Facebook and Twitter and increasingly on Instagram, where lots of parents in particular and some students are engaging. That said, I don't necessarily advocate for the district, anyone from the district, or board members to engage in the conversations that occur on other folks' social media. I do believe that we have an opportunity to use social media to get some of our stories out and to be able to share information that may only appear on our website. And let's face it, most people aren't getting up in the morning and wondering what's on our website. The beauty of social media is it reaches people where they are, and we can tell those stories and share that information and let people know how to get involved through social media. But the minute that you see a post in a neighborhood group or a community, chat about something, and you as an individual board member start to chime in, my sense is that's a pretty slippery slope, and it's hard to unring that bell. Mix my metaphors there. So it's really important to just sort of, again, I would say let that ride, and to use social media as a barometer to be able to get a sense of what are people talking about, at least talking about online. And is it just a sort of a handful of folks who are really upset about something, or is the level of engagement and the misinformation or information that's out there tell us something about how we are succeeding or failing in our communication strategy around that particular issue? But again, just as I was saying about response to public comment, I believe that the minute you chime in, even with something that may seem so simple, someone may even ask a question and try to get you to chime in, or state something that is so blatantly false that you're just dying to correct it, then the floodgates are open. And it's hard for you then not to answer someone else's questions or correct some other misstatement. So I really encourage you not to be tempted to fall for that. Another thing I often advise the boards and superintendents that I work with is to think about sort of your audience a little bit. And I think sometimes the reason that we have a little bit of panic when social media comes alive with misinformation is that we tend to assume that if one person posts something that is blatantly untrue, that everyone else is just going to accept it. And that may be true for some folks. I think there may be some folks out there who take everything at face value, but I really believe they're in the minority. And sometimes I don't think we give our families and our staff and our constituents enough credit for having some discernment. I personally don't read everything online and take it as gospel, and I suspect you don't either. And I think we have to give our parents and others a little bit more credit for their ability to say, well, just because Freddie posted that in the group doesn't mean it's true. And maybe I have to ask someone else or get some other opinions or do a little homework to find out what is true or not true. I'm not saying everyone's going to go to that level of scrutiny, but just not to sort of panic and assume just because someone posted one thing on Facebook that everyone's going to assume it's fact. So here's a question from the chat that I want to respond to because it sort of goes to the heart of the matter. Jennifer says, how do board members respond to misinformation on social media when it moves so quickly? Waiting until the next board meeting could be weeks. So again, right, I think what's tricky is I don't want board meetings to be the only mechanism that you all have to communicate with your public. Your district should be set up that you can reach your parents and staff in particular through a number of channels: email, your own social media accounts, your website, in-person meetings. You have other ways of getting this out. So rather than sort of respond to the particular issue on social media, if there's lots of information out there, say about a building project or a new policy or your budget, gather that misinformation and put together the correct information. I'm a big fan of writing something called fact versus fiction or frequent answers to frequently asked questions. Compile all that so that you have and can give to the community what the right information is, and disseminate those tools through all those channels I just laid out and others. Again, it's not about waiting for a board meeting or going back to that thread on social media, but just giving people the tools. And what I have found is once you email someone that FAQ, someone else in the community, some other parent, will link to that FAQ in that Facebook thread or that Twitter conversation or however it's playing out. Let them do some of that work for you, but give them the tools that they need to have the right information. Thanks for that question, Jennifer. A couple more things on social media. Which accounts? Again, I'm a big advocate for the district having one account. I know some places where the board has its own account that's separate from the superintendent/district. To me, it's not a great idea. I believe that in order to sort of be a unified front, the board and the superintendent should have one account that they share as sort of the perspective of the district. And that if the district is doing its job well, that it uses those tools to be able to communicate what the board needs to communicate to the public about its meetings, about any policy decisions that are on the table, about its budget, and so on and so on. But the minute there are separate accounts for those two, to me, the optics are, again, all about sort of an us-them camps. And then a final point, I think I sort of mentioned this just about commenting. Again, I know it's tempting to want to sort of jump in. Even if you say I'm jumping in not as a board member, but just as a neighbor and a resident, very hard to sort of take those hats off. And when you are an elected official, if you are replying, people aren't going to say, well, she's writing that not as a board member, but just as a parent or a taxpayer. I'm not as convinced that that is easily said as done. Okay, a couple more things, then we're going to get to your questions, more of your questions. Crisis communication. This is another area where I think boards sometimes wonder what is an appropriate role for them to play. In my experience, most of the time, most crises that I have seen are the responsibility of the superintendent and the superintendent's team to manage. Certainly anything to do with sort of an emergency in a building, anything to do with sort of a facilities issue, personnel matters, even all of those things generally fall within the purview of the CEO. There are some exceptions. Where it's more important, I think, for the board to step in is if the crisis has to do with your areas of responsibility, a budget crisis, an issue that comes up that is truly sort of rooted in policy, where the policy is called into question, or the issue at hand has strong policy implications, or if the controversy or the crisis has to do with the superintendent. That is your employee, and at times it's going to be the responsibility of the board to chime in on that. But I think sometimes there are other crises that become so high profile that the board starts to feel, oh, we need to weigh in on this. And if we're being true to our roles and responsibilities, the answer to that is often, well, no, you shouldn't. Even though it has escalated, it is still the superintendent's responsibility to manage it. You may have to weigh in with a comment to that effect, but not to start getting involved and confusing the public about what your role is and isn't in solving that crisis or controversy. Just backing up a bit, Amanda asks a good question here. Should the person running the social media account respond to comments on the district social media page? Great question, Amanda. My advice is no. So I was communications director when Facebook and other social media platforms were sort of starting to get some traction in Boston. And my team and I proposed that we create these accounts and have BPS be present on at least Facebook to start. And there were some folks in our administration who thought we were crazy, and maybe they were right, no. But they really said that's going to become a full-time job, just managing those accounts, answering every question, responding to every comment, trying to separate fact from fiction. And what we decided early on was that is not our role. We are going to post a story or share a piece of news and let it roll. We're going to let the public say what they will, as long as they adhere to the guidelines of that page. You know, no personal attacks, certainly no profanity, no threats, all those kinds of things. But for the most part, letting people say what was on their mind. And I think the fear was that that was going to become an absolute mess. Certainly some of the comments over the years have been ugly, as we would expect, just as they're ugly in person. But we realized, just as I was saying about board members, it's far too slippery a slope for even the person managing your social media account to try to keep up and comment, in part because it's not always clear what you should comment. So we have just made it very clear on our pages, and I encourage districts to do just this, that we won't respond to questions or comments, but we of course invite you to comment. And there are conversations that happened. What was encouraging and perhaps pleasantly surprising was how much parents in particular sort of policed one another on these sites. And I didn't require someone from my team to say, that's not true, because often a parent would chime in and say, well, no, actually my kid goes to that school and that hasn't been my experience. Or you're absolutely wrong about that, and here's the evidence to prove it. So again, giving our constituents a little bit of trust, recognizing it's not always going to be perfect, but the alternative seeming completely unsustainable to me, at least. Great question, Amanda, thank you. Okay, so now let's get to your questions and comments. For those of you who haven't had a chance to chime in yet about anything we've talked about so far, or really anything related to the board's role in communications, or particular challenges that you're working with in your districts. I guess I should ask Patrice, Lisa, anything you want to chime in on before I throw it open?
No, I really appreciate what you've shared. I think that it clarifies a number of the gray areas, if you will, that exist around the board's role in communications.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Okay, the question box open. Yes.
Jennifer had asked a question, I think it right before the one that had to do with responding to social media.
Oh, thanks. I missed that one, Marie. Thank you. So Jennifer asked, our board has a communication committee, a subset of the board. What can you recommend for the work or roles of the communications committee? That's a great question. I have found that at times a board will create a communications committee because they are dissatisfied with the way the district is handling communications. And that's fair. Just as you might create, a committee for anything else that you think is not working as well. What I think it sometimes evolves into is that committee functioning more like district employees and trying to manage content and get involved in the day-to-day operations of communications that fall squarely within the superintendent's role and responsibilities. So I think if there is going to be a communications committee of the board, it should be focused on the things we have talked about today. How are we evaluating the superintendent in terms of communication? How are we serving as ambassadors and communicating with the public about our district plan, our goals, vision, mission, and so on. How are we engaging the public about their issues? Do we have good systems and processes in place to make sure that parents can navigate the district with their questions and problems and concerns? Again, just making sure that you're staying in your lane, as opposed to the communications committee saying, oh, let's design a social media campaign around the robotics program. Way too in the weeds. But I think there's also important work that that committee can do in terms of thinking about how the school board functions in terms of communicating with the public about its work. Thank you for that question, Jennifer. Okay, let me get to some other questions here. Becky, I think I only got a portion of your question, so if you want to try that one again.
I took care of Becky.
Oh, thank you so much. Kira or Kyra says, could you expand on the social media comments? Our district turns commenting off on all posts. Do you feel it's more friendly or approachable for families and parents to leave the ability to comment on? Thank you for asking this. I meant to say that and I lost my own thread. Absolutely do not turn off the comments function. I have seen districts do that and the optics are horrific. Social media, by definition, is interactive. It exists because people want to have conversations. A social media account with the comments turned off is a web page, and that's why you have a website. If you want to post a story and let no one engage about it, that's what you have a website for. So I really believe leave those comments on, let them roll. You've got to do a little bit of monitoring just to make sure people aren't being wildly inappropriate or doing things that are illegal. But no, never to turn it off. Thank you for asking that. The floor is open. What else is on your mind? Did I miss any others, Will Marie?
Yes, I have one here from Christina, who's before Kira's question.
Oh, gotcha. So how do we get younger people to interact more with the community? Are there methods we can use that you have found effective? Christine, could you elaborate on the question, what you mean by getting younger people to interact more with the community? While she's doing that, Becky says, we've had to address comments, presumably in social media, by parent leader volunteers, negative discourse used by PTO leaders. Yeah, I've heard that other places too. I think, PTOs can really be, they can enhance the work or really challenge it. So it's important to strengthen those relationships. PTO meetings are also a great place to sort of get, to engage with folks. Again, not for the board or the superintendent to show up and be the provider of information, but just sometimes to show up and listen. But making sure that your PTOs have those tools that you've produced and they have the right information, so that if they are spreading misinformation, it is not because they don't have the facts that they need in order to share the right information. But if there's a vacuum, they're often going to fill it, and not always with the right stuff. Okay. Deborah says the district does a great job reaching families and staff. Informing the broader community is more difficult. How and when should info be shared with other community members? This is important regarding improving faith in the use of the budget. Ha, Deborah, another great question. You guys are awesome. You're hitting all these really important points. So I think one of the things that we are definitely guilty of in this sector of K-12 is that we tend to speak to the folks we have immediate access to. And that is primarily our parents, our students, and our staff. It's the folks that are in our database that we have email addresses and phone numbers for, the folks who are in our buildings every day. We are not as successful, sometimes for logistical reasons, about reaching everyone else. Frankly, taxpayers who pay our salaries, community leaders, others, influencers in town, people who get to vote on important matters that sometimes affect schools. So I really think we do have to do a better job, as Deborah is suggesting, of reaching those folks. What we tend to do is try to reach them when we need something from them. We need them to vote on an override or a school building construction project. By then, it's often too late, I have found, that we have to think about today, starting today, how are we keeping the community informed and engaged? Are our outreach efforts for our community forums and our budget hearings and our events, do we just use our internal means of communication? Do we take out ads in the newspaper? Do we use the local media to reach folks who are not in our schools every day? I often encourage superintendents to submit guest commentaries, guest op-eds to local papers, in part for this very reason, because it's a great way to let other folks in town who aren't part of our immediate district community what's going on. Sometimes those op-eds, especially if they're about policy issues or the budget, can be co-signed by the superintendent and the board president. There are lots of other strategies too. One of the things I often encourage superintendents to do is to just develop an email list of the, let's say, 50 most influential people in town. Maybe some are elected officials, some may be priests and pastors and rabbis, others may be leaders of nonprofits, higher ed. Take that list and send those folks some sort of communication on a regular basis. Maybe it's monthly, maybe it's every other month, maybe it's quarterly. I don't really care, as long as there's some sort of schedule where they can hear from the superintendent about perhaps a particular topic, not 95 items in a newsletter, but maybe it's just a reflection on arts education or why the work of student athletes is important or anything like that. Again, the content is important, of course, but what's even more important is those leaders hearing from the district regularly, and not just because we're asking for more money, to know that they're trying to keep a relationship. In some cases, I've seen superintendents form sort of an advisory committee of people from the community who these folks have, they have a flock, whether it's their congregation or their organization or their neighborhood group, but keeping them involved and engaged, and not just to tell them what you want to hear, what you want them to hear, but also to hear from them about what they're hearing from the folks that they listen to. It's a really important strategy, and one that, again, shouldn't wait until you need to ask the community for something. Thanks for that question, Deborah. I love it. So Christina, back to her question about getting young people involved. I would like to see them feel less apathetic with the process and feel they can communicate with us. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's sometimes tricky because generations don't typically communicate in the same way. And I don't just mean that in the obvious sort of language thing or the sort of social media cliche, but just our styles and our forms of communication are not always compatible. I think sometimes the methods that we have grown up with may not be what the next generation is interested in, or the generation after that, or the one before us, right? So certainly there are folks who are far more expert than I am in community engagement, and folks who are even more expert in youth engagement. And I've seen schools and districts do a good job of finding these nonprofits and putting them to work about creating strategies specifically for engaging young people. And those strategies may look different for elementary or middle school than they do for high school, but they can help you structure ways of getting younger people engaged and involved online, in person, in schools. But I can tell you, and you know this already, for most of those folks, it's not about coming to a school board meeting. That is not their scene. So how do we meet them where they are and create structures and opportunities for them to engage in ways where they feel comfortable and can truly contribute about what's on their minds, what's working for them in school, and what's not. Thanks, Christina. Divya, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, Divya asks, what if we get pushback from administration when the board wants to have an informal conversation over a contentious issue, say in the budget? Well, it's a good question. I mean, to me, this goes back to making sure that the board and the superintendent are on the same page about what your roles and responsibilities are. And certainly, I would hope the administration would see the value in having a board that is willing to have informal conversations, especially if it's over an issue, as you say, like the budget, that falls squarely within your roles and responsibilities. Any administration that's pushing back on that, I would want to know sort of what is the nature of that pushback. Is it that they don't want the board to have informal conversations or no conversations at all? But to me, anything that sort of puts too tight a rein on that may be misguided. Now, there may be other perspectives from the superintendent that I'm not aware of about why that is not working or what have been some of the consequences of those informal conversations, but it's important that you and he or she sort of really unpack that and address those in advance of that becoming up as an issue. Deborah says this is one of the key responsibilities for our communications committee. I'm not sure if that refers to the student work. Probably the broader community work. That's great. I think that is a great role for that committee, Deborah, especially because folks on the board often have relationships that district folks don't have. They may be parts of other organizations or in their professional lives. It's great to leverage those relationships and give the district a broader sort of reach, if you will. Yeah, Divya is saying that those communications where you get pushback from the superintendent are often with parents. I mean, there's no way around it. I think, the board has to have some license to have informal conversations with parents. As Patrice says, those may occur in the parking lot or the soccer field or the nail salon. You have to be equipped to have those informal conversations. And in fact, those are sometimes the most powerful and credible conversations where you can sort of set the record straight about certain things and clarify the work that the board is doing, but also to hear from parents about how they are receiving the information. So to me, that's something really important for the board and the superintendent to iron out, especially if there's some turnover in your board. It's a great sort of subject matter for sort of those board retreats or however you get together and figure out how you're going to work together. Communication is often sort of the centerpiece of those discussions. Julie asks, on the topic of public comment, we have recurring issues where individuals are unsatisfied with no response at public comment and not happy with district response, and therefore take the topic to the press and so on. Some board members are then displeased with the nature of the press coverage and want to correct it. Any suggestions on how to handle that? That's a good question, Julie. It's a big question. I mean, I think to me, you have to have a press strategy that isn't reactive. I mean, I think working with the media is always about not waiting to hear what the parents have brought to the press, and the press therefore wants to play gotcha with the district, but sort of being ahead of that. So when you know that topics are controversial, I think sometimes we have a reluctance to go to the press with them because we're afraid of what they're going to do with it. Again, in the absence of that strategy or that proactive effort, someone else is going to go to the press. And the first thing those reporters and editors and producers are going to hear is a parent's take on that. And it may be very different than the district's take. So it's about leading with your version of the things, to use a cliche, driving the narrative, and going to the press before something becomes an issue to lay out what the issues are, why it's coming up, how you're dealing with it, maybe even anticipating some of the pushback and anticipating that and being able to set the record straight on it. When the parents go to the press, if the press, are operating as they should be coming to you and asking for your comment and being able to sort of, again, clarify any misunderstandings, but also just acknowledging that you recognize there are different points of view about this issue within the town. To me, this is less about public comment. If a parent is sort of saying, I'm putting this out there in public comment, it's not just you're not responding in public comment, but presumably there's some sort of vacuum, whether it's the website, social media, e-news. They are not hearing, perhaps not just what they want to hear, but much of anything about this particular topic. That may be the case. In other cases, parents, I get it, are just sort of at their wits' end, and they're not going to hear. They don't hear what they want to hear, and say you're not being responsive, even if you've taken every step imaginable to try to address their questions and concerns. You may not just see eye to eye on the issue. Thanks, Julie. We've got a few minutes left. Any other questions from the group or any other comments from my colleagues?
Just giving it a minute for some questions, Chris.
Yeah.
We got a couple coming in.
Here they come. Here, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. Do you have strategies to increase overall parent community engagement with content? Our website, our socials, our board meetings. Sometimes feel like we're not reaching enough of our audience. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to me, this is a great reason that districts need to invest in communications. What I hear everywhere is the bad stories get all the exposure. They get all the scuttlebutt in town. And there's so much great stuff going on in our schools that nobody knows about. Well, I hate to say it, that's going to continue to be the case unless someone is tasked with helping to get those stories out, finding those stories, crafting them, and disseminating them through all of your channels. So I just did a session about this with another district yesterday about just finding some time. Again, maybe it's just a part-time person or a stipended person, but to be that point person in central office for those good stories and having the skill to be able to craft that story, not into a manifesto, but even 200 words about what that achievement or innovation or accomplishment is, putting it on your website, taking a great photo, and then using that nugget, that little narrative and an image, and sharing it on all your social platforms, including it in your e-news, sharing it at board meetings, using every tool in your toolkit to get that story out. Not everyone uses all the same channels, but I'm pretty confident that if you use enough of the channels, most people are going to see it not just one place, but presumably more than one, and it'll start to get traction. The beauty of social media, again, is that sharing component. So if you have a great story about an awesome innovation in the math program at your high school, and you can consolidate that story, put it on your website with a cool image, share that link on social media, parents and teachers and others are going to share that story. And then it's not just your followers who are seeing it, but it's their followers too. That's how these things grow and have a ripple effect. Thanks for that question. Nick asks, in any district, 10% of your community will always support the board and 10% will never support anything you are trying to do. It's the 80% who have no opinion who we need to focus on. Use the 10% who support you to help, but focus your efforts. By the way, this is still Nick, we tend to expend most of our limited source of energy responding to the negative people. I think there's some real truth in that statement. I might just tweak it to say that as a public entity, we can't sort of write off anyone. I know that's not what you're suggesting, but unlike a sort of a political campaign where you say, we're never going to win those people over at one end of the margin, so let's just forget about them. In public sector, we can't quite do that. So we have to be mindful of all 100% of our constituents and listen to them, even if they're never going to be seeing an issue the way that we want them to see it. By the same token, as Nick says, there are folks who we have already won over, who see things the way we do and they're in our camp. Rather than just check them off and say, great, we've got them, how do you leverage them? It's a really important point. Parents listen to other parents, teachers listen to other teachers. So if you have folks who can help carry the water about a particular issue, make them effective ambassadors and communicators. Leverage them again on social media, in the schools, in PTO meetings, for them to get up and talk to their peers about these issues is so much more credible than, with all due respect, anything that a board member or a superintendent would say. So it's really having strategies in place to be able to identify those folks and equip them with the tools and opportunities they need to be able to support you. Okay, the questions are flying in our last 5 minutes. Do you work with teachers unions about how to put together great messaging? I don't personally. My work has all been management side work, but there are certainly folks out there who do that. Thanks, Becky. Amanda asks, do most boards have a communications committee? I don't know the numbers. I would say it's more rare than common, is my assessment. Would you, my colleagues, say the same? I'm seeing nods, yes.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Carol asks, in budget season, we want to communicate with the community, but forums are poorly attended. What might work better? Good question. I mean, I think it may not be that the forum itself is the problem. I think one of the things that we are sometimes guilty of in this sector is expecting people to come to us, and we have our school committee, a school board chamber, and we say we're going to have 3 forums in that room over the next 5 weeks, and they're all from 6 to 8 p.m. on a weeknight. Hope you can make it. What we don't always do is sort of figure out what's going to work for our community, and holding these things in locations that may be closer to folks. So one of the things we tried in Boston was our budget hearings were all held in 6 different schools that were in 6 different parts of the city. They were held at different times of the day and the night, and sometimes on Saturdays. It's not ideal for a lot of board members and district staff, but if we want to reach people, we've got to be generous with our time and our flexibility. I think it's also maybe about not having every budget hearing even in a school or our own properties, but are there community centers or libraries or other locations where we can hold these sessions and let other people host us? People may feel more comfortable in those spaces. Are our sessions truly accessible in terms of language? And are we clear about that in our communications? Are we reaching linguistic minorities with these sessions by going to places where they may be congregating or spending their time, instead of expecting them to come downtown or to a school where they may feel intimidated? Again, I'm thinking also about the structure of the meeting. Is it a typical sort of budget hearing where the board and the superintendent are up front and we have a microphone and you get to come up and speak your piece, listen to our PowerPoint, you've got 3 minutes? That can be intimidating if you're not in this line of work. So how do we think about those budget sessions? Perhaps more like the community forums I described, where there are smaller groups or breakout sessions, structuring it in a way that people may feel more comfortable and engaged. Thanks, Carol. It's a great question. Becky, I'm concerned the teachers' unions have specific agendas rather than about teaching and learning. That's a big comment, and I tend to agree at times, but it's probably outside the scope of what we're here to talk about today. I will say that I think, regardless of how a union positions itself, the district's job is always to, whether it's in negotiations or just during peacetime, if you will, to be able to be clear about what its positions are. And one, how much it values its teachers and all of its staff, and how your contract presumably reflects those commitments, and that you are ultimately always about student achievement over adult needs. Monica asks, is there more information out there in regard to the logistics of forming a communications committee, a base template maybe on how other districts are doing that? I'm sure there is. Lisa, do you have anything on that?
I don't, but can certainly try to gather some information on that.
Yeah, that might be helpful. Again, I don't have a lot on this, in part because I tend to think that if a communications committee does its job, they should put themselves out of business, because if they work closely with the administration and that administration puts the infrastructure in place to implement what the committee's goals and expectations are around communications, then there's no need for that committee. That may not be a popular opinion, but I gotta be me. I think we have time for one more question. Back to Divya. What would you say is the ideal role of the communications committee of the board when the superintendent has a robust format for the administration, not typically for the board's voice? Well, then yes, then that is a problem, because I think if we're going to say that the superintendent and his or her team sort of manages the tools and is the driver of those channels, then that team has to be thoughtful and proactive and strategic about how to make board work very much part of that content. So it's not enough for the district to put out its stories and its priorities. As someone who's a communications director in Boston, I had to be very mindful of what the board needed to get out too. Again, not just the logistics of their meetings and their hearings and their proposed budget and this vote or that policy, but also trying to tell stories about the board. I think boards can be very misunderstood, and I saw it as part of my job, as I know CABE does, to help educate the public about what is a board member, what is a board of education, what is their role, what is not their role. That is all important content that a communications plan and a communications team, whatever it looks like, should be helping to educate the public about. So there's less sort of uncertainty and ambiguity about who does what. My clock says 1:15, so I'm going to turn it back. First, I want to thank you all for participating. Great questions. I'm going to thank you for your service in this really important role. I know it's more difficult these days than ever before. Please stick with it. We need you. And I want to thank my CABE friends and turn it back to Patrice and Lisa to wrap us up.
Okay, great. Chris, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to work with you. A couple of things that I just wanted to mention in relation to some of the questions or comments. First of all, I'd be remiss if I didn't share with you that CABE does have a training module about communications that's part of the Lighthouse training that we do. To get more information about that, reach out to Nick Caruso here on the CABE staff. and he'll happily share what that involves, but it's a board work. It's not work for an individual. So there is that. Those that asked about how we get younger folks involved, particularly students, you should know that we are working with CAS and their student program there to develop things. For instance, we talked about this yesterday, tips for engaging students in the work that's being done in the district. So watch for that. And this is going to be coming from the students. They're the ones creating this, not the adults saying, hey, here are some great ways to engage with students. Another thing, as far as getting the positive word out, February is I Support My CT Public Schools Month. We have a hashtag that goes with it, and we're encouraging districts to share with us videos of the great things going on in your districts. It could be the arts, it could be classroom, it could really be anything that's positive going on in your district. You still have time to share that with us, and we're sharing those things out to share your good news with audiences that you may not normally reach. So if you want more information about that, reach out to me following this meeting, or have your staff in the district reach out to me. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, March is Board Member Appreciation Month in Connecticut. You may want to consider asking your staff if they might want to do something on Meet the Board Members, or doing a piece in conjunction with Board Appreciation Month about what the work is that the board does, and maybe equally as important, what the board's work does not include. But just to help to gather around that event being Board Appreciation Month, to help you share out things that we hope will help you in the work that you're all doing. So I wanted to share those with you all. Anything?
No, thank you very much, Chris and Lisa, and thank you for our attendees for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Have a great afternoon.